to John Paitakes. He's been a probation officer for 25 years with the Somerset County Court system. And he recently wrote a book of 50 years working in criminal justice. Tonight he's going to be talking about facts and fictions in criminal justice. Please read.
Thank you, Vince. All right, good evening. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. Say just a little bit more about my background. That was my first job with the Somerset County Courts. I was a probation officer for 25 years. I was teaching part-time at Raritan Valley Community College, and I was really enjoying the teaching part-time. And somebody said there's a one-year opening in Seton Hall University. And I said, well, a 1 year, but I mean, I'm a civil service person here, guaranteed. I'm not sure about that. I thought about it, and I said, well, if I don't make the change now, what am I waiting for? So I took the early retirement. The 1 year turned out to be 20 years at Seton Hall teaching full-time in criminal justice, and I really enjoyed it. I helped students get jobs and coordinated that. And my intention was to stay there until final retirement. When I got a call from somebody from the governor's office, and they said, we're creating an alternate position, meaning that when one of the regular members, there's 15 full-time members on the State Parole Board. And I don't know if you're familiar with what they do, but they're sort of like judges. They sit in pairs of two. And as people are eligible for parole, inmates, they're interviewed, they look at their background, and they decide who gets paroled and doesn't. So the alternate would fill in when somebody's on vacation, out, et cetera. So you have all the same responsibilities. It's a governor's appointment. It's a 6-year appointment. It tends to be somewhat political, but you don't have to know the governor, but you have to have sufficient experience in criminal justice. So I got the appointment. That was 6 years part-time. And I was able to work it out with Seton Hall when I didn't have classes, that I could teach, I could do the hearings. Well, the term was up, and a new governor comes in, and then they can reappoint who they want. So my term was up. I felt, well, that was a great experience. I'll just finish off my working years at Seton Hall. About a year after that, a different governor came in. They said, you've been recommended since you were on the board once before. Would you take another 6-year appointment? And I had to do some calculations and everything, but I couldn't maintain the schedule between that and the university. So I retired from Seton Hall about 6 years ago, and I just finished my second term on the State Parole Board. So during that time, and just so you get an idea of my background when I talk about some of these issues, I interviewed over 7,000 inmates in prison, and that was quite an educational experience. And so now I'm sort of, I say part-time retired. I do guest appearances at libraries and other communities such as yours. And my intent now is just to kind of clarify some of the myths, because as you probably know, when you hear something about a crime on the news, is that all the facts? No. I mean, it's an ongoing investigation, and the people reporting it usually are not criminal justice experts, right? It's your newscasters. And so I look at that very carefully, and I find out in many cases, it was somewhat different than what you might have seen on what they first said. So anyway, that's my background. I wrote a book, 50 Years in Criminal Justice, years ago. I have a few copies left. I'm selling them for $10 a piece now. And it talks about my career, but then also the different things in the criminal justice system. So that's optional for anybody who's interested. So on the handout, we said, once a criminal, always a criminal. Okay, and you probably heard that from a lot of people. Don't trust that person, et cetera. And I'll tell you generally the numbers. About 60% of the population does become a repeat offender once they get out of prison, okay? Now, about half of them will go back to prison because it was a serious offense, all right? But the other half may just get community service or a fine. It was a minor municipal court offense, all right? So, it is a high percentage that doesn't make a good adjustment. But I can mention a lot of cases where somebody took advantage of all programs. There's a lot of different programs in the prison, and I don't know how much you might be aware of that. And again, probably not if you haven't been involved in the system somehow. But there's vocational training. They can get their high school diploma. In some the prisons, you can even get some college courses. Now that money doesn't come out of the state budget. All right, a lot of private corporations have donated money because they believe in rehabilitation, and only inmates who are well behaved and appear highly motivated will get an opportunity to do that. So again, my point is that if you're motivated as an inmate, and look, I've been in most of the prisons in the state and a number of the county jails, and some are nicer than others. Some are quite archaic or whatever. Some are air conditioned, some are not. People age quicker in jails and prisons because of that environment, So again, my point is that it's not always it's certainly not a nice place to be for any length of time. But as we would explain to inmates, if, you did a crime and, it warrants serving some time, then try and make the best of that bad situation. Okay. Take all the counseling programs you can, take all the vocational courses you can. You get certifications in different things like carpentry, electricity, plumbing, etc. All right. But you have to be well behaved. If you're trying to smuggle in drugs or a cell phone, which you can't have in prison, then you're not going to be able to do all that, So take advantage of that. And for example, if somebody got a 10-year prison sentence, okay, do they have to serve all 10 years? No. Okay. What's the earliest you think somebody can come out of prison on a 10-year sentence? 5. What else? Who said 3? Hey, have a cookie. You're right. But anyway, yeah, it could be 3 and maybe even under that 3. All right, because the formula is in 1/3 the time they're eligible. Okay, that doesn't mean they get out. They're eligible to come for the hearing that we would do. They get good time credits for every month that they don't get in trouble. All right, so they may get 5 or 6 days off the sentence for that. Okay, so it could even be a little under the 3. All right, so we would explain to them at the beginning, look, the 10-year sentence, it sounds harsh or whatever, but you could be on the street in less than 3 years. If you don't get involved in fights, you don't try and smuggle in drugs, you don't bring in any contraband like a razor, a knife, a cell phone or whatever, and you can be out here early, all right? And so when they come up for parole, and look, we don't get any reward for either keeping somebody in or releasing them. I mean, we're happy if somebody made a good adjustment, get back out there, do something productive, start paying taxes, get back into society or whatever. Because on the other hand, what does it cost to keep somebody in prison for 1 year? Anybody have an idea? All right. Well, actually, there's not an exact answer. The average is 50 to 60,000. But if it's somebody that needs an operation, senior citizens that need a lot of other assistance, it could be 90,000. It could be 100,000 or whatever. All right. So they're going to get medical care and all that while they're in prison. So you can't always say, well, to save money, let's let them out of prison. No, that's not right either. If they're a danger to society, then regardless of that, they should stay in prison is most people's philosophy that's involved in the criminal justice system. But, we want them to get out there if they're following the rules. If they're not, then, they're a danger to society. And the overall goal of corrections and criminal justice is public safety. All right. So that's, kind of my thing on the inmates that don't make parole. Now, if they don't make parole, so we interview them, let's say after 3 years. All right. We decide after we read through sociological reports, psychological reports, we interview them, and gut feeling comes into it too. It's not a scientific thing, but sometimes you can tell by people's facial expressions, how they handle themselves during the interview or whatever. And, you have this feeling that they're not going to make a good adjustment out there. I always used to keep in mind that how do you think this person would react if you bumped into them in a supermarket or someplace, and you can tell sometimes their anger, if they're really still, emotionally, upset about the whole system. So, it's not an exact prediction. it's your best educated prediction based on all the information. Okay. And then, somebody has to do it. I've worked with all the people on the parole board. All of them have had some experience in either criminal justice, either private attorneys, social workers. We have 2 priests on there. So they've been involved with human behavior, and 2 people have to agree. The 2 board members have to agree whether we should parole you or not. If we can't come to agreement, then we have to bring in a 3rd person, and then it becomes 2 out of 3, So we try and do, or we try to do our best educated thing. But of course, we've all been notified that if somebody was paroled and they got in trouble again, it was like, who did the hearing? Who did the hearing? Well, maybe I did the hearing. But again, if I went through all the reports and read everything and we did the interview, it's all recorded, then, that's what happens or whatever, What I found was that motivation is the key factor. Okay. The inmates that have been successful, all right. We've had ones that have worked into managerial positions in Burger King in the supermarkets, et cetera, went into their own businesses, or if they got a certification in prison for electricity or plumbing. You know what plumbers get an hour now? Over $100 an hour. Same thing with electricians, car mechanics, 125 or whatever on most cars. So, they can be successful. And there is that small percentage, I will say, that acquires that. So the goal is to, try and, improve that rehabilitation rate. Okay. And, money is a factor too, because when it comes to programs in the state budget, there's a lot of other departments. And where do you think criminal justice comes, or prisons? Usually at the bottom of the list. A lot of people feel, well, if they did a crime or whatever, they should be punished and locked up or whatever. Well, maybe what they don't realize is that 95% of the people in prison, they're coming out at some time. Okay. The only people that stay in their whole life is if you had the death penalty, and we don't have the death penalty in New Jersey now. You're there until you're executed or die, or life imprisonment without parole. Okay. Life imprisonment without parole means you're there until you die. All right. But that's in a very small percentage of cases. Life imprisonment doesn't mean your whole life. After 25 years in prison, you're eligible for parole. Okay. And now that's one case takes a whole day on something like that, because when it's a murder case and the person did 25 years, we really want to be sure on something like that, or as sure as we can be. So it's the majority of the board. There's 16 people on the board. It's got to be 9 people interviewing that one person, which could take almost the whole day. They go into every nook and cranny since the time the guy was born. We get additional reports from a psychologist if we have to, and then we make a determination. So again, they can come out. In most cases, they end up getting several extra years. Maybe the second time they come up, they might get paroled, if they really were a model citizen, while they were in there. Anyway, so again, anybody have any questions or, different things that they want to mention about it, feel free to, ask me. Does prison make better criminals? Well, yes, it can. I knew a warden who was a superintendent of one of the prisons, one of the state prisons in New Jersey here. And I had him as a guest speaker when I was at Seton Hall. And I heard really good reports about this superintendent. And when he gave his talk, he said, look, when a new inmate comes into the prison, I'm the guy in the middle. Okay. And I'll talk to him first, and I'll say, on this side, you're going to be tried to coerce by gangs that are in the prison or certain other groups. They break into different groups or whatever, and they're trying to get drugs to get them into the prison, or they're trying to get cell phones and, sell them to, other inmates or whatever. And so that's one half. And he says, then I have the other half is the social workers, the counselors, the correction officers that want to try and get them rehabilitated. And I'm trying to, it's like a tug of war, the gangs and all that, they're trying to get that person on their side. Okay. Because that's one more person they have in their gang. And for rehabilitation purposes, the social workers, the counselors, they want to get that person, squared away so they don't have to come back to prison, So who does good? Well, you just have to be motivated. Okay. Even though it's not a nice place, take advantage of every single program in there. There's anger management, there's counseling focused on the victim, there's group therapy. Okay. It's not mandatory. But again, if you go, you get a certificate of attendance. That looks better on your parole record when you come up for parole. Okay. Prison industries is where they make your license plates. Okay, your license plates, all the street signs, stop, go, et cetera. That's all made in the prison. All right. There's a separate section that is industrial within the prison, compound. And it's not a real big program. It should be a lot bigger. Financially, they're on a budget too. But anyway, so inmates can apply for that. Now, you have to be well behaved. You can't be under any disciplinary thing or involved in fights with other inmates or with the correction staff or whatever. You can't be caught with any contraband, cigarettes or cell phones or anything else that you're not supposed to have, drugs. And they're interviewed. And if you get through all that, then they'll assign you to that. That's 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, working in this special unit, which is making license plates. They make podiums. They make all the prison uniforms. They make the sneakers, the boots. There's even a little restaurant on the grounds of the Department of Corrections. It's called the Mates Inn. So if you're in Trenton and you want to go to a little restaurant, it's very reasonably priced. It's on the grounds of the Department of Corrections, all the administrative buildings. And they went through culinary training or whatever, and they're expert cooks and everything. All right. And it's open to the public. And a lot of the people working in Trenton end up going there. But anyway, so that's another trade you can learn. They also get paid a little bit more. Did you know that everybody in prison gets paid every hour of the day? It's a small amount. It's like 30 cents an hour or whatever. And they don't get it in cash. It goes into their account where they can go. There's like a little 7-Eleven store within the prison. They can buy potato chips or toothpaste or shampoo or whatever else they want to get like that. But in prison industries, you'll get $1 an hour. Okay. So again, there's always a waiting list trying to get in there or whatever. So it's really good for several reasons. One, that they can learn a trade because they're making all these things that require using, some equipment from, technology or plumbing, et cetera. But the other thing is that the superintendent tells me that they're the best behaved because they don't want to get dropped from the program. And they realize, most of them, that, hey, this is something I'm learning that'll make me more marketable when I come out of prison, right? Because again, remember what I said, 95% of those people are coming out at some time and they can move into areas, close to you or me or buy a house in that area too. And, unless it's a third-degree sex offender or whatever, they can pretty much reside, where they can afford to. So you have to think realistically about that too. Anyway, that's an excellent program, Prison Industries. Everybody's hopeful that they could expand that even more because the results are usually pretty good from that. There's no rehabilitation program. Well, we've been talking about that. There is rehabilitation if you're motivated. Okay. I mean, it's almost like any other habit. I don't know. I'm sure some of you are maybe former smokers. Maybe some are still smokers. I was a former smoker. But you have to realize that at some point that, what, this really isn't good for me. This is cancer causing, right? And I smoked for about 10 years too, until I got a wake up call that I said, geez, why am I doing this or whatever? I kicked the habit. I did it my own way. Instead of going for any kind of professional services, I just weaned myself off, in other words, if there's 20 cigarettes in a pack, go to 19 for a couple of days, okay? And then down to 18. And it took about a month and a half. And what you're doing is you're weaning yourself off that need, that works. But again, it's motivation. And the same thing with somebody who's drug addicted. Do they really want, to kick the habit? We have programs, in the prison, outside the prison, private programs, et cetera. So, referring to the inmates, they have to be motivated to change their lifestyle. Okay. And there is assistance there if you want it. Okay. The only other mandatory program in the prison is your GED, your high school equivalency. Okay. They have to go for the training for that. Now they have to pass the exam. All right. They're not just going to get a degree for going to the classes. Now they have to pass the written exam about that, and they'll get their GED, which is equivalent to a high school diploma. All right. So that one they have to go to. For all the other programs, it's voluntary on them. So again, though, but when we would see that as a parole board member, the guy comes before me or the woman, and they took no programs while they're in prison. And I said, why didn't you take any programs while you've been here for 5 years? And they said, well, I don't have a problem. Well, what are you doing here? I mean, you did something wrong, some kind of a need, some desire or whatever. So the motivation I found is the key thing. The inmates that were successful, were just motivated to turn their life around. We even have a criminal justice professor in one of the universities out in the state, and went on and got his doctorate. Made a good choice of turning his life around or whatever. And who knows the prison system better than him? Being on probation and parole are a slap on the wrist. Now, you might have heard about that. I heard it a number of years when I was working as a probation officer. Oh, they got away with murder. That's no big punishment, et cetera. Well, it all depends. Now, in Somerset County, we were fortunate, we had a good, reasonable caseloads. Yes, sir. Yeah, okay, that's a good point. I'm sort of, I guess, taking it for advantage. But anyway, all right. So probation is community supervision. So if it's a minor offense, it wasn't something very serious, the judge will say, I'm putting you on 3 years probation, and you're assigned a probation officer from the court. All right. And so you have to report to that person several times a month. You have to maintain a job. If the condition was that you go to counseling, we have to make sure you go to counseling. If you need housing, we'll help you get housing. And so we'll help you through any problems during that time. You have to pay off your fine, et cetera. So they can do whatever they want as far as, going to school, working, living at home, but they have to report to the officer at least once a week. Okay. Depending on the reporting schedule, sometimes it might be 3 times a month or 2 times a month if they're a minor problem. So you're at home, you're in the community, less serious offenders. Okay. The only people on parole, or you had to do time in a state prison. Okay, 1 year or longer. The minimum is 1 year. Let's say we paroled you after 3 years. Okay, you're not done with that 10-year sentence. You got 7 years of parole supervision. And so it's very similar to probation because, all right, so you're out of prison, but you have conditions and you have to report to that parole officer several times a month. Okay. So is that cleared up? Yeah. So obviously, the people working with parolees are more serious offenders, okay? But they're really not, they're more social workers than anything else, the probation and the parole officers, all right? Really what they're doing is counseling, trying to turn these people's lives around, okay? Yes, they can arrest them if they've done something wrong, or if they're not following the conditions, or if they're not reporting, or if they're not paying on their fine. Yeah, they're going to be violated, and they may end up getting some jail time as a result of that. It's and how effective they are depends on their caseloads. All right. So in other words, you get a caseload of offenders. In Somerset County, it was average about 40 cases an officer. Okay. And that's just about almost the ideal thing. All right. But then you could go to Camden, let's say, or Newark, and they have a caseload of 100, 120. So that's a lot more difficult. You don't have the time to spend with them. In California, they were having caseloads of 1,000. And you know what the supervision was? They would go to a kiosk machine at the mall or something and answer like 10 questions. Are you still working? Did you pay on your fine? Did you move? Et cetera, et cetera. No face-to-face contact. Is that supervision? But because of budgetary things or whatever philosophy of the courts there, I'm not sure. I think a lot of it was budgetary. So anyway, whether it's effective or not depends on the resources you give them. So if you give them reasonable caseloads, yes, probation has a higher rehabilitation rate, okay, than parolees, mainly because the parolee. It has probably been in prison at least a couple of years or whatever. And it goes back to the learning thing. Now, if you want to take the other end, can you learn more crime in prison? Well, yeah. I mean, you got a lot of experienced people there in crime, So if you get dragged toward that and they say to you, look, we can guarantee you making a lot more money than working at McDonald's or Wegmans or wherever, the temptation's there. Well, then you got to ask yourself, do I want a lot more money with the chance that I may be back in prison? So there's a term you may have heard, prisonization. Prisonization means that you've now become part of that system. And that can happen when the sentence is too long. Okay. One of the judges came up with this idea years ago about shock incarceration. Okay. So even though the person did something fairly serious, let's put them in jail at least for a couple months. Or if it's a state crime, at least for several years or whatever, rather than a lengthy sentence. And maybe that'll be a wake-up call to them. Okay. So yes, that shock thing could work on some people. Okay. Or some can just think, well, I got away easy with it or whatever. All right. But the longer you're in there, 5, 6, 7 years, well, now you've made, who's your peer group? It's all other inmates. Right. And so then you start thinking, well, look, these are my friends. We get along good. They can get me cigarettes sometime. They can even get me drugs sometime. And if they bribe the guard, in the right way, they can even get me a cell phone. And so that becomes your thing. And you say, well, it's not that bad. They're taking care of my health and I got a place to stay or whatever. And maybe it was better from where they came from, so they become prisonized. All right. I'm sure a lot of you saw the movie of Shawshank Redemption, right? Where finally the older guy who had been there for a real long time, I forget, he was like the librarian and all that. So finally, when he's about 80, 85 years old, he maxed out on his sentence. They can't keep you any longer than your sentence was. All right. So if his sentence was 15, 20 years and he did all of them, well, at 20 years, we got to let you go. He goes out into society. He got a job in some kind of supermarket in a little rooming house by himself. He committed suicide. I can understand that. His whole frame of reference and friends were in the prison. He had been there like 30, 40 years or whatever. Okay. So the prisonization thing is, it's hard to believe, but some don't want to come out of prison. There's a small percentage that don't come out of prison. And I had a guy who was my partner and I, 80 some years old. He had been in prison for a long time and he was coming up for parole. And we had his records in advance. And at the initial years, he had some problems adjusting and, he got some disciplinary action against him. But for the last 4 or 5 years, he was a model inmate. They had him running the laundry system in there. He was mentoring young inmates. So we read all that. And I look at my partner before he came in and we said, geez, this guy looks parolable, but we'll go through the hearing anyway. So the guy comes into the hearing and so his first words out of his mouth were, I know I have to do the hearing, but I don't want to be paroled. We said, oh, wait a minute, this is a parole hearing and we'll make the decision and we'll let you know. So we have to go through it. And he says, well, okay, I'll go through it, but keep in mind, I don't want to be paroled. And we're like looking at each other. This guy doesn't want to be paroled. Anyway, we go through everything and he could see how the thing was going. And he kept saying that during the hearing. And he says, look, everybody's disowned me, my family. I have no friends on the outside. My wife divorced me after a number of years I was in here. My kids never come to visit me or whatever. I want to stay here or whatever. And we said, okay, well, what we do is after the interview, we tell him, wait in this other waiting room. And we deliberate as to, what do we do with this guy? And right away, we looked at each other and we said, this guy's parolable. I mean, he'd been in so many years or whatever. So we call him back and we say, you will be paroled. And he gets upset. He stands up and he said, I told you I don't want to be paroled. Well, this is a prison. I mean, it's not a social institution or a hospital or whatever. So, it's for people who are dangerous, et cetera. And he was not a danger at that point, but I could understand, and I think you probably could too, that had become his whole life, and then they come out on the outside and things, you see how fast things change on the outside. They don't get all those fast changes in prison. Okay. They have limited use of computer and it's, monitored very closely, et cetera. But, and as far as news, they get certain channels on the TV, et cetera. So, that prisonization can happen when they're in there too long, so that's something to keep in mind too. But again, the overriding factor is always, are they a threat to the community in any way? And if they are, most of our philosophy was, well, no, they should, be in there. Where else are we at here? Oh, well, this is a hot one. Police using excessive force. There's been a lot on the news about that lately. And that was horrendous what we saw with that incident. Where was it, in Tennessee? Where the 5 officers, beat that guy to a pulp just about. That's very unusual or whatever. And certainly nobody could condone that, But again, when you look at the numbers, New York City, biggest police department in the country, over 40,000 police. What percentage, have been, using excessive force? It's a very small percentage or whatever. And again, there shouldn't be any excessive use of that. But, there's the good, the bad, the ugly in every profession. So you're going to get a few bad apples in any profession, whether it's education, doctors, lawyers, priests, et cetera. I've interviewed all those people in prison. Some doctors, some priests, former correction officers, former police officers. There's a few bad apples in every thing. So is that any more than a lot of other professions? Well, you'd really have to do a complete detailed study. Sometimes it does become political, and in most of the cases where excessive force was used, a lot of times things escalate. And there's in the police academy, they teach them an upward use of force. As the offense becomes more dangerous, you can increase the amount of force that you're going to use and the equipment, et cetera. When they stop somebody for questioning or whatever, and if you run away or you resist, right away that triggers emotions on both sides, and so then it can escalate. Now, that's not an excuse for the officer to use, deadly force, but you can see what happens. So in most of those cases, if they didn't refuse and just went along with it, you'll get your day in court. If you really didn't do it, then, you should be exonerated. So that's my general response to that. I don't have a lot of, nationwide statistics with me or whatever. I taught some courses at the police academy here in Somerset County and in a couple other counties when the community policing came about, which was an excellent program where they would train. There was a special training to have the officer become more involved in the community, walking the beat. The community officer worked in the school system, et cetera. That was a great program for a while. But when they were short of police, one of the first areas they were cutting were the community policing officers. And I thought that was a big mistake because some people said, well, that's a soft way of policing or whatever. Well, no, they were doing counseling like a social worker on the street and trying to help people who were homeless or kids who were having a problem with school or needed, some other assistance. So they're starting to build that up now. Now that's becoming popular again, and that's good. But the dilemma we're finding now is that because of all the things happening in law enforcement, people don't want to join the police departments. When I first started teaching at Seton Hall 20 some years ago, I would ask the students, how many want to be a police officer in a class of 25 or 30? And at least 10 or so always raised their hand. Some wanted to go into probation, some wanted to go into parole, other related court positions. Now, when you ask, maybe one hand will go up. No. So that's what we got to be concerned about too. Police are retiring by the groves now, in large numbers, or leaving for other states or whatever. And so a lot of departments are having a hard time, filling the ranks or whatever. And so that's important for public safety. Questions or issues? Anybody else? Yeah. Yes, sir. That's a good question. Do you ever hear of hooch? The word hooch? they make their own sometime, or somebody shows them how to make it. It probably could get smuggled, and that's a little bit harder than the cell phone and drugs or whatever. And so there's probably some cases of them smuggling it in, but they make their own. So they had painters, and they use sometimes inmates to paint certain things. So they're hiding some of the turpentine or some of the cleanser or whatever, and then they save apples that they get at lunchtime or whatever, and wait till they get rotten, and they make their own what they call hooch or whatever. It'll give them some kind of a high. It'll also give them brain damage, and could also die from some of that or whatever. So that can happen. No, smoking is not allowed in the jail. Now, that doesn't mean it doesn't happen. If you pay off a guard to look the other way or whatever, and the same thing with drugs. How do drugs get into the jail? Well, one way is the correction officer. The inmate will say, hey, look, I can have $1,000 dropped off at your house. We know where you live. They'll know that too. And so make sure I get, a cell phone, et cetera. That's one way. The other is on visitation day. It depends. Now, there's different visitation procedures in different prisons. Okay. Like you saw in some of the old movies, like there's a glass plane and they pick up a phone and talk. That still happens in some of the prisons, but some they can have contact in a conference room. All right. It's supposed to be monitored. There's not cameras in all the different rooms. Correction officer is supposed to be walking around watching. They can embrace their husband, wife, girlfriend, whatever, initially a quick embrace, and when they're leaving, the same thing. So use your imagination. Sometimes that can happen. They can bring in their baby child or sometimes even a kid sometime. So again, use your imagination. You can see how something might get smuggled in. If the correction wasn't watching, very closely. So that's how drugs gets in, usually between those two. Yes. Depending, while they're in prison or out. In prison, no. While they're in prison, they're not voting in most states that I'm aware of. Okay, they're not allowed to vote while they're in prison. Well, there's been a lot of controversy about that, and it's understandable what you're saying. Inmates have filed suits. I'm not sure exactly of the status of that or whatever. I haven't heard yet that, it was completely overturned or whatever. What they've overturned is like, it used to be also, even when you come out on parole, you can't vote. Now, but that varies from state to state. And some states were saying, no, they still can't because they're on parole. But the other side of it was, well, now they're out in the community. If they made parole, that means they made a satisfactory adjustment. So, so they can do that. And it used to be even on probation, you couldn't vote, but now they can while they're on probation. So I think they're slowly, turning a lot of that around, Yes, sir. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, I'm sorry. That's a good point, and it raises an interesting thing. When I first came on the parole board, it was over 30,000. Okay, now it's down to about 13,000. There's been a major decrease in the prison population. For a number of reasons too. When COVID came around too, the prisons, well, nobody was ready for it, but they were the least prepared. Okay. And you weren't able to segregate them or whatever, and it really flourished throughout the prisons. And even visitors didn't want to go in. Even parole, we used to go in to the prison directly and interview them, et cetera. And we were like leery of that too. So we started doing video conferencing with them. We'd go to a main office and we'd interview them over TV. We're pretty much back into most of the prisons now. So there was legislation passed at that time in New Jersey that they were looking for ways to reduce the population, right? And try and make sure that it wasn't dangerous people. They came up with a ruling that a lot of us in parole didn't agree with it, but that if in the last year, if they had no infractions or they didn't assault any correction officer, they should be paroled in the last year of their sentence without a hearing or anything. And a lot of our feelings were that, well, there at least should be that hearing just in case, even if it's your last year. If you're under the previous criteria, if you appeared to be dangerous or information in your record appeared that way, then, we would deny it. But with that, it was like as long as you didn't have a new charge against you while you were in prison, parole them. So a lot of people got paroled early. And so it's down to 13,000 now, they've even closed one or two prisons in the last 10 years. Okay. Because again, it's expensive to operate the prison and, all the staff and equipment and everything else. Yes, sir. In the back, you had. Well, it depends. When you say turn the corner, well, okay. But are you talking about he gets convicted of a new crime? Oh. Well, give me an example of how he's not complying. Not reporting, not paying on a fine. Well, all right. So it depends on what's that? Oh yeah, no, he has been committed a crime. You have to be. Well, the sentence was probation, 3 years probation. All right, and then he has a list of conditions: report as directed, pay on your fine, go for counseling if you've been ordered to go, etc. And it depends on the condition that he violated. Okay. We'll first give him a warning. Hey, you've missed reporting dates. Okay. You can either make them up, etc., or, we may charge you with a violation of probation. But again, it's probably not going to result in sending him to jail or prison over that. Right. No. Yeah.
Person now. If I put on a show like you, that mean I'm sure.
Yes. Yeah. It's not a perfect science or whatever. Now, when you say first, let me go back to you said he's saying he's doing everything right or whatever. Well, we know there's a high percentage of lying during the interviews. I mean, they know what we want to hear, so. We want to back that up with some kind of, when you say you went for rehabilitation and counseling, what were the first 3 steps of anger management? And if they say, well, I don't remember, what's the first 2 steps? And they can't even mention 1 step, then they weren't really paying attention. So I mean, we have ways to try and validate what their thing was, but paying on the fine, we want to collect that money because it may go to a victim, or it could go for court services or whatever. So you don't get off probation until you actually pay your fine. And so they'll realize after a period of time that they better just borrow this money, hopefully not steal it, and pay off that fine. Otherwise, you'll be reporting for a long time. So it depends on the seriousness of the violation. We had what we called adjustment sessions. So if it was something somewhat like that, their attitude, not reporting regularly, et cetera. We have an adjustment session. And instead of going to court the first time, we set up a hearing in the office in the probation department. And I was assistant chief. So they would come before me and have them sit on the other side and look, what's going on? These are the repercussions. We'll give you one last warning. Next time you tell it to the judge, and the judge will probably be more, severe or whatever. So sometimes that deferred some of them. Now, the parolee, it's a little bit stricter. The parole officer has a little bit more leverage because, again, this is a state inmate. And look, to be in a state prison, you got to earn your way there. With people, I would sit in a courtroom and I would hear people say, oh, the poor guy got 10 years in prison. Well, if you looked at the background, you don't just go to prison for shoplifting a candy bar or something. It has to be an indictable serious offense. All right. Minimum is 1 year. Maximum could be up to no maximum. So I came to the conclusion that, who's ever in prison, they earned their way there, really. It usually started off as a juvenile, and then they didn't pay attention or follow the rules. And then they were on probation, and then they didn't follow the rules. The judge ordered something else. So finally, the judge, the more often you appear before the judge, the more serious the sentence is going to be, because the judge is like, well, wait a minute, we tried this and this and this, so obviously you need a wake-up call. So maybe now we go with the shock thing. That's another step. So they usually try and do it incrementally, Now, the other factor is what depends on the sentence. Well, all right, usually the sentence, the crime itself, okay, the crime itself and your prior record are the two determining factors. Okay, the crime, obviously, if it's a murder crime, a rape, an assault, arson, aggravated assault, you're going to get, prison time, first offense or not. All right. But if it's a series of burglaries or whatever, then, you'll see that culmination of offenses. So they've, worked their way there. But how else is it determined? Well, the judge. Now, the judge has sentencing guidelines, all right? And there are some judges who are very, I won't say punitive, but hard on crime, like, oh, no, I think, automatically this guy needs some prison time or whatever. Others were more social work oriented, so you might see a lesser sentence, all right? So the judge's philosophy and attitude and personality plays into it too, and maybe in a few cases, politics or whatever, look, we've had a couple judges in jail also. So again, remember what I said, there's a good, the bad, the ugly in every profession. So the judge, okay, the prosecutor, right? The prosecutor makes a recommendation to the judge, right? Whoever prosecuted the case or whatever. And usually they're going to take a pretty strong punitive end of it. But the other person that does, and it's not advertised so much or whatever, when somebody's found guilty in court on a indictable offense, right, the judge doesn't sentence them that same day. So you'll notice when they say they set a court date like 2 months away. And do you ever wonder why are they saying 2 months away? Is it that busy or whatever? No, that's for the probation department to do what they call a pre-sentence report. It's a social investigation report, and it's assigned to a probation officer. And I did some of those too. And it's very interesting. You go back to from the time that person was born, and you search like how they did in school, where they need discipline problem in school. We can get any school records. What kind of work did they come from? What's their family life like? What's the neighborhood like? What do they do in their spare time? What kind of job, et cetera? So you compile this social background report, and that goes to the judge about a week or so before sentencing. All right. And ideally, what's supposed to happen is that the probation officer who wrote that report meets with the judge, and the judge would ask him, well, look, you did the report. You know this person better than I do. What do you think he or she needs? Okay. And maybe I would say, well, look, I think he needs a wake-up call, judge. We've tried this and this and this time. Yeah. Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. You all right? Should have said something before. So that officer makes a recommendation to the judge. Now, that's not final. The judge will agree or disagree or whatever. And he'll say, okay, I'll make note of that. I found that in about 85, 90% of the cases, he goes on what they talked about a couple of days before the sentencing. Okay. Now, again, that's not to say that the prosecutor, doesn't have an effect. Yes, he has an effect. But again, who knows that case better than the person who did that report? So that's another determining factor. So all those things play into the sentence. Yes, sir. Oh. Well, so I got to agree with him sometime. But anyway, well, how do you become a judge? How do you become a judge? All right. So there's two ways, and it depends on the state, right? So New Jersey, the governor appoints the judges. Okay, the governor appoints the judges. So Paul Murphy. But anyway, so and it is political. I mean, you would think ideally, what's the criteria to be a judge? Well, of course, you got to go to law school and you got to pass the bar. Okay, that's it. Okay, doesn't say that you had to be a public defender or a defense attorney or a former prosecutor. Those are good backgrounds for it, and some have. Okay, a lot haven't. One was a real estate attorney. Nothing wrong with that. But again, that's a whole new field coming into the criminal courts. You know, in some states, it's a popular vote. You go to the polls and you vote for the judge. I think Texas and a couple other states, right? So then it's a voting thing. But to answer your question, I mean, political, yes, it can be political when the governor appoints, you know. No, we don't have voting in New Jersey. No, the judge appoints, you know. So that's political. You don't have to be, let's say if it's a Republican governor, it doesn't, that you have to be. And in fact, it's always encouraged that they have, I won't say an exact balance, but you have representatives from both parties as judges. Yeah, you know, that's an ethical, moral thing on the judges or on the governor and the judge themselves, you know. Yes, sir.
It's the percent of repeat offenders and take that into consideration. Multiple incidences.
Percentage is about 60%. Yeah, it's high. But again, doesn't all mean real serious offenses, general offenses. Okay. The background. Yeah. When we do the parole hearing, we have their whole file from when they first started. And not that we're retrying those cases, because a lot of times the inmate would say, well, I did that years ago. You shouldn't be held against me. No, it's not held against you. You were already sentenced on that. And you served whatever you did on that, but it shows us something about their character and their background and all that. So it is important for that, you know. Again, you know, we really primarily look at that present offense and then how they adjusted within the prison, you know. I mean, the difficult cases are when, you know, you see somebody who, you know, raped a 14 or 15-year-old kid or whatever, or even younger, you know, and we've all had kids or whatever. And, you know, I have two daughters, whatever. And I'm always thinking, this son of a gun. I mean, would you ever want to parole that person? But the bottom line is on those very serious offenses like that, the family member has a right to come in and talk to one of the parole officers, one of the parole board members who's going to do the hearing before the hearing. All right. And we really leave it up to them. They come in, they meet with us one-to-one, and they say how that's affected their daughter, their son, themselves, or whatever. And it's all recorded. And they say, please take this into consideration. In almost all cases, they say, and that person should never be paroled. Okay. And I did some of those too. And the one that always sticks out in my mind where this guy had raped this 15-year-old girl when she was in high school, and he got, I think, like a 10-year sentence or whatever, and he was coming up for parole after about 6 years. He was turned down once before. And the mother was saying, you know, my daughter couldn't even talk. She said, you know, she hasn't been able to have a boyfriend since that happened. She doesn't want to go out at night. She still has nightmares. She's still in counseling 5 years later and whatever. And I'm thinking, oh my God, you know, but then you get the record on the guy, and the last couple of years he's been a model inmate. So what do you do? Your gut feeling is like, this guy should never get out, you know, what he did to that girl and how it's affected her and maybe even for the rest of her life. But again, the parole procedure is that if they're not a danger at this particular time, and the psychologist says he's a low risk now, the corrections staff says he's been a model inmate, you know, he works in the prison, he has no problems, he hasn't been caught with any contraband, then the onus is to parole him, right? So now the worst part is, somebody's got to call back the parent or whatever and say, oh, yeah, we had the parole hearing, because you have to notify them of the results. Now, they all love to hear, yeah, what happened? Oh, they got an additional term. Oh, great. Now the guy that raped your daughter will be released. Okay. He's been told not to, you know, be in your area at all. If you see him around, report it to the police right away. They get hysterical. You know, can we appeal, et cetera, et cetera? Yeah, you could appeal. But again, you know, it's all been recorded. The facts are going to, you know, determine that he should have been paroled. Yeah. You know, there's probably not an exact answer on that. Yes, it could. It could. Depends who's doing the check. And when you say, well, when we're doing it, we'll get all those records. Okay, now you're talking about like if a private agency tries to get it, whatever. If you got a good investigator, they can get all that. Yeah. The juvenile record's supposed to be more confidential, anybody like under, 18 considered juvenile in this state. It's supposed to be more safely guarded, but even that can come out. That can come out. There's ways that can come out. Yeah. If you got the right investigator. It's in the back there. All right. That's a good question. We have like 13 state prisons. How do they determine where? Well, yeah. It changes periodically. Like I said, there were 16, and they closed a couple, and my last count was, I think, 13. So they get sentenced to prison today in Somerset County. Right? They don't usually go the same day. They'll sit in the county jail or whatever. The records will go to State Department of Corrections, and they classify offenders. Okay, so based on their offenses and background, et cetera, there's a classification method, and I'm not completely aware it's all in that. And that determines maybe populations at the prison, distance from their family, all those things are looked at or whatever, and they determine where they go. Now, the more serious ones, like a lifer is going to Trenton State Prison, or that's where we have the execution chamber too. So when they were doing executions, and that's gone back and forth over the years, the execution thing. There is a classification system, and that determines where they're going. And then even once they're in that prison, if the correction superintendent finds that maybe this should be changed to a different prison for whatever reasons, gangs, et cetera, we can transfer them to other prisons. Yeah. You're not talking about the woman's prison, Clint. Yeah, here. That's the example I'm making. Yeah. Well, that one's under a complete review right now. They're even talking that'll be closed down maybe within the next year or two. They've had so many problems there, and also the way that one's located. I don't know. Are you familiar at all where it's at in Clinton, the women's prison? It's spread out in old little cottages on a large piece of property. And it's very archaic in a lot of ways. And they've had so many problems there that a lot of it was from the correctional staff, the correction officers, So there are all kinds of committees looking at that, but standardizing it as far as some things are standard in all the prisons, but then the superintendent has a bit of flexibility too, because he gets a budget for his particular prison, Northern State, which is opposite Newark Airport, Trenton State Prison, different superintendents. So they may decide how to break up their budget. Like, I don't know, one superintendent might say, we want more barbed wire and razor fences around here, et cetera. And the other one that I used as an example before says, I want more rehab programs. So he puts more of his money into the rehab programs, so they do have a certain amount of flexibility. So when you say standardized, it's not completely 100% standardized. The basic admittance classifications, certain systems are, but Yes, sir. Well, they go to a federal prison. Yeah. Sometime if they got put in New Jersey, where they were out on federal parole or whatever, we put them in prison or whatever. And if our offense is more serious, they come to some agreement and we say to the federal, we'll hold them here until they do all our time here, and then we'll send them to you to do their time or whatever. And so the federal system, I haven't worked in that. I mean, that's, completely different. There's, we have one federal prison, I think, down in South Jersey. Uh, I got a lot of them. I'm thinking of writing my second book on the most unusual cases, but the one that stands out on this one, this was always at the top of my list, and maybe some of you remember this one, happened probably about 30 some years ago. And the name is Tommy Trantino, was a cop killer. Him and his partner, Trantino, yeah, you probably all know that one. He was actually originally sentenced to execution when we had execution. What was it, in the mid-60s, I think it was. And then when we got rid of that, they turned it to life imprisonment, but not life imprisonment without parole. So over the years, and I remember reading about this case even when I was at Seton Hall, even beyond before the parole board or whatever. And it was him and his partner. They were out at a bar and drinking and on drugs. An off-duty new rookie police officer came in. Somehow they found out that he was a police officer. They took his weapon away from him, stripped his clothes from him, did some weird things or whatever, and then shot him in the head a couple of times, took off. One guy got caught in New York and they said he died in a shootout, right? Trantino gave himself up after that or whatever. Goes to I think Northern State Prison or Trenton State Prison. Anyway, so after the 25 years, he came up for parole a number of times, and he was turned down almost every time or whatever. So I get on the parole board, and I'm an alternate, and I'm only going to get called when somebody doesn't show up. So it was a pile of cases, or his background was about that high of folders. So I read it anyway, figuring, who knows, maybe somebody won't show up for that hearing. And it had to be, at that time, I think there were 17 people on the board, so it had to be 9 people. Somebody calls up at 5 o'clock in the morning, I can't make it. So I got the call that they be in Northern State Prison, 8 o'clock in the morning to do be part of the Trantino thing. So that went on from 9 o'clock in the morning till 4 o'clock, just on Trantino. But the thing that got me, but when he first came into the room, and you talk about attitude and gut feeling, he came into the room like, now, here's your opportunity. You're talking about trying to get out. And he's bopping into the room and he looks at the board, and we were sitting like a horseshoe kind of thing, all 9 of us. And he looks at the chairman at the time, who was, in the head seat there in the middle. And he looks at him and he says, I don't know why I'm doing this, but you're all political hacks of the governor, but we'll do the hearing anyway, he says. So the chairman says, well, if you want to sign off on no hearing, then we'll just make it. Nah, let's go through this farce anyway. That's how he starts off. So what does that impression give you of this guy, right? So that's hard to put in the background and say, well, I'm going to be objective about this. But we had all the information. And so they asked him every question possible, and every board member could ask him, and he could ask any board member anything. So I'm the new guy. I had only been there a couple of months, and I was sitting like on the end like that. So they say, okay, let's start off over there. So he looks at me and he says, well, you see, in the earlier years, I had a lot of problems in prison and all that. But the last couple of years, I've been a model inmate. So that means I should get out of prison, right? Don't you agree? So I'm trying to think of a fast answer. My answer is, well, Mr. Trantino, that might indicate that you do good in a confined setting. So perhaps you should be here a little bit longer. No, that's not what it means. Well, that's what you're saying. But actually, so it went like that the whole time or whatever. Now, I think, try and connect all the facts on that we denied him anyway. At the end, we found enough to deny him on. We thought we did. He appealed it. He had some high-priced attorney that he wasn't paying. Maybe the guy wanted publicity. I forget who it was. But so he got it heard by some upper-level judge or whatever, who said, well, I think, the parole board was a little too harsh or whatever. And they said, they went for an in-between step. They said, well, at least put him in a halfway house. Okay. A halfway house is like, we do that sometime with people coming out of prison if we're not completely sure. It's like a group home in an area. They get them a job in the local area, a daytime job, and then they come back to a halfway house every night and they get counseling, and they can't leave that house. So it's a form of corrections, but a lot looser, and they have a regular job during the day. So they pulled them to a halfway house. All right. So we were all like, we still felt he belonged, and a lot of other people did too. All the PBAs and the family of Trantino were picketing the parole board all the time, but I heard he had a girlfriend while he was in the halfway house, and then he assaulted her or something. And I don't know, the last I heard was that he moved to another state. I don't even know if he's still alive yet. But anyway, that was one of the most unusual cases. And I mean, there's a number of them I could tell you about, but maybe we'll save that for another talk. Yeah, I'm running late here, but
What?
yeah. Oh, that's automatic on that one. Yeah, he gets that protection kind of thing, and notify the police or whatever. The parole officer, in his mind or her mind, will put an emphasis on making sure that that's probably the best we can do. Yeah, I know I'm running over, but anyway. Thank you for your attention.